You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. We're looking at closing out the decade here with the last podcast of 2019. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's been quite a while that we've been doing this podcast. We started initially recording this way back in 2014, but here we are closing out the decade and looking forward to 2020, which I think is going to be a big year for a variety of reasons. So we had originally conceived of doing another retrospective podcast. Listeners might have enjoyed our previous episode, which we got some good feedback on, looking back at the year that was 2019 in Asia, talking about some of the biggest trends that came out of the region and reviewing what they really would mean going forward. But today we decided that it would actually be more productive to look forward, and we've done this before on the podcast as well. And actually here I'll also plug the upcoming issue of our magazine, which should drop in the first few days of January, where we have a great range of authors looking at what is to come ahead in the year ahead in Asia across a variety of regions, the United States, Japan, the Koreas, China, Southeast Asia, mainland and maritime, Oceania, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia. Really the entire gamut of the regions that we cover at the Diplomat are included here. So Prashant and I, because we usually do this podcast in 20 to 30 minutes, we're not going to be able to go into depth into all of those regions. So if you're interested in kind of planning out your year and planning out the issues that you should really be thinking about in Asia in 2020, really recommend taking a look at our upcoming issue of the magazine. But I thought we'd do a similar format to the previous episode, Prashant, where each of us could perhaps emphasize three issues that we think are really going to weigh on the year ahead in Asia. So to kind of kick us off, I thought you could tell us what you think is going to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to keep an eye on in the coming year.
Yeah, so I guess my first one is kind of probably the most obvious one, the elephant in the room, which is sort of the evolution of U.S. Asia policy in a presidential election year. And this is obviously a cyclical thing. And to add to that, there's always going to be a focus on U.S. Asia policy in key Asian capitals because the United States just has such a big presence and a big role in the Asia Pacific. But next year in particular, I think will be, very interesting with respect to this because you have obviously the U.S. presidential elections in November, but also, continued speculation about who the eventual Democratic nominee might be that's going to actually contest President Trump in the election. And we're going to see continued storylines next year about, the continuity and change in U.S. Asia policy. What will we have in a second Trump term or a new Democratic administration? And at the same time, we're also going to be looking at a series of events in Asia that will be occurring in this context, right? So North Korea, U.S.-China competition, Taiwan elections early next year, but then also the events that the Trump administration might have next year as well. So the talk about a U.S. Southeast Asia, U.S. ASEAN summit next year, that's always going to bring about a discussion about what the United States' role in the region is going to be. So I think that's one which we'll all be looking to very closely in 2020.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that really is the elephant in the room. I think especially for many of our listeners in Asia, and you and I both travel to the region a fair bit, and the question we both tend to get is, tell us what's going to happen in the United States, which is obviously a very difficult question to answer given the fundamental unpredictability of the Trump administration. Although maybe unpredictability isn't the right way to think about Trump anymore, because in a way, with the sort of attrition of more conventional foreign policy advisors from the administration, especially given the constellation we had in 2017 with folks like Jim Mattis and the like. The Trump administration now looks a lot more like Trump himself. The constellation of advisors around the president are not the kind of people who are likely to second guess or bureaucratically maneuver to constrain the president's options, right? We don't even have a John Bolton-like character in the administration anymore who might actually work in a very efficient way as a bureaucratic operator to keep the president from actually enacting his foreign policy agenda, which creates new dangers. I think you had a very great, good overview of many of the big issues to come up next year, and I certainly think the U.S. is going to be looming over everything that we talk about almost on this episode. But one thing I will add also is, managing American alliances in the year ahead. We
Mm.
are coming up on a deadline for the U.S. South Korea alliance cost sharing talks. The special measures agreement does not look like they're going to they're not going to be able to reach an agreement by the end of the year because the U.S. is simply asking for way too much money, $5 billion, when the South Koreans are barely willing to go up to $1 billion, if that even. So we'll have to see if they can compromise there. U.S. Japan cost sharing talks are set to kick off as well. That agreement has to be finalized by early 2021. So those two issues, I think, I would also put on the agenda for next year. It's going to be particularly interesting to see how Trump's foreign policy, given that it is going to be at its Trumpiest, is going to deal with the issue of alliance cost sharing, especially given the president's record on criticizing alliances as effectively scams for the United States and treating them as protection rackets. So that's going to be something that I think is really going to be a big part of the conversation next year. And of course, in the South Korea-Japan context, we're going to have contentious intra-alliance talks going on at a time when conditions with North Korea are likely to also get worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot to be watching next year, and I think in all of this is sort of the big question in the room, right? Which is relative to what the United States is doing. How is China and how are other players like Japan, India faring in the region as well? These notions of Indo-Pacific cooperation, Indo-Pacific convergence will always be looming ahead. So, what was your first key thing to note in the forecast for 2020?
Well, I'll segue straight into North Korea policy because I just briefly
Mhm.
mentioned that. We talked about this on the last episode, and this is actually something that a lot of people are talking about as the year comes to a close because Kim Jong Un, the North Korean leader, has set up this dramatic end of year deadline when we're all expecting some kind of major demonstration. Maybe it's even happened by the time this podcast episode comes out, depending on how fast things happen. But he's threatened a Christmas gift. But I think the big lesson is that, or the big takeaway going forward into 2020, is that the wheels are coming off of the administration's North Korea diplomacy. The Singapore process that began in June 2018 is really no longer in place. There is no process. It appears that we are likely to return to a crisis. This is something that I've written about for the upcoming issue of the Diplomat magazine, so I recommend listeners to go take a look at that to see how we actually got here and the fundamental incompatibilities in the diplomacy. Now, the question going forward, and here maybe we do get a little bit of uncertainty, and there's sort of, I sort of see two schools of thought on how Trump is likely to respond to the wheels coming off North Korea diplomacy. One is that he will continue to do what he has done and simply ignore it, cover his ears, and pretend that nothing is wrong, even if North Korea launches an ICBM or, God forbid, conducts a nuclear test, which I think is probably less likely at this point. But the reasons for that, I think, being, the Trump administration has really set up North Korea as a major victory, and the president is not one to really take responsibility for any kind of defeat, so to speak. So ignoring North Korea, something that he's done to date with over, 26 missile tests so far, could be an option. The other option, though, is that we go back to where we left off in 2017. We get threats of fire and fury. And this is really, I think, one of the biggest risks to Northeast Asia, a renewed round of crisis with North Korea. And the North Koreans, I think their options are also becoming rather tight. We have had some interesting developments, though. I mean, here in New York City, the Russian and Chinese delegations at the UN have mooted sanctions relief measures at the United Nations Security Council. So that's something to watch early in the next year. And the dynamics there, I think, are quite misunderstood in the sense that this is not North Korea really coordinating with Russia and China to get sanctions relief done at the UN. I think it's more an attempt by the North Koreans or an attempt by the Russians and the Chinese to show the North Koreans that they are willing to advocate on their behalf in New York, but that might become more difficult if the North Koreans begin acting out. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese want the North Koreans to go back to nuclear testing or ICBM testing, so floating these sanctions relief measures at the UN is a good way to show North Korea that Russia and China appreciate their adherence to their moratorium on long-range missile testing and nuclear testing, and they should continue to adhere by that. So it'll be interesting to see if the North Koreans do ignore that and they do conduct some kind of major demonstration, if Russia and China simply abandon that. But yeah, that's something that I'm going to be following very closely in the coming year is the overall deterioration. And, we have to also mention the inter-Korean context where things have really, I think, fallen off a cliff for President Moon Jae-in, especially with South Korea coming up on assembly elections. That's going to be something quite important, I think, the souring of inter-Korean ties and the South Korean public's sort of coming to terms with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, with it seems like we're headed for a very interesting year in North Korea. We have the legislative elections in South Korea, as you pointed out, the expiry of this sort of deadline from North Korea, and a US presidential election. So definitely seems to be one that will be very interesting to watch next year.
Yeah, I think the notion. So, just one more thing to add is that I think the notion that North Korea, Trump has tweeted, I think that North Korea shouldn't interfere in the U.S. election, and God knows what he means by that, given that he, still won't really own up to Russian election interference. But I don't think, North Korea policy is not something that many American voters are really thinking about when they are thinking about who they're going to vote for, especially along party lines. So I think that's probably not where this is going to go, that the North Koreans are really going to tilt the scales on how the American public thinks about certainly President Trump or any Democrats here. But yeah, I think going forward, North Korea is certainly going to remain at the top of the diplomatic agenda next year. All right, so turning it back to you, what's your second thing to look forward to next year?
I think the second thing that would be important to note next year is Taiwan's upcoming elections, which will be early next year. And I think Taiwan elections are always very interesting to watch, right? So the quality of debate and the extent of conversation that you get ahead of the elections. When I was actually in Taiwan earlier this year, I heard a lot of conversations already about the lead up to the presidential campaign. But I think in the context of U.S.-China tensions that are continuing this year, you have a presidential year in the United States, and the United States is a key ally of Taiwan, and where I guess in some of these major Asia elections, we have talked about in the past, issues of managing foreign interference and disinformation has been almost a routine storyline in several of these key elections, and I expect in Taiwan it's going to be an issue as well. We have elections next year in countries like Myanmar, countries like Singapore, potentially. They haven't announced a date yet. But Taiwan is viewed as sort of ground zero for these broader trends that observers look at, whether it's Chinese coercion or disinformation or foreign interference. And there's cross-strait relations, and Taiwan are also one of the key flashpoints that we watch in Asia. So irrespective of what the outcome is in Taiwan's elections, whether we see Tsai Ing-wen get another term or whether we see another outcome, I think those will be very important developments to watch. And the other thing is, even if Tsai Ing-wen gets a second term, how she acts and how her administration acts thereafter will also be interesting to watch, given the mandate that they receive. And that will kind of play into broader things that we talk about on the podcast regularly, which is, U.S.-China relations, how countries are dealing with growing Chinese assertiveness and the like.
Yeah, no, that's something that I think we're gonna be dealing with very early. The election's going to take place on January 11th, 2020. So certainly it'll be one of the biggest stories to kick off the year. I think the strategy in Beijing has really been to turn this election into a referendum on Tsai Ing-wen's cross-strait diplomacy, or rather the lack thereof. China has shown that, China's trying to convey to the Taiwanese people that Tsai's, independence-leaning approach to stewarding Taiwan has not yielded positive dividends, right? So China's been isolating Taiwanese diplomatic allies, plucking them away from Taiwan, crunching Taiwan's economic options across the strait, and of course the interference efforts that you referred to, I think, are really poorly understood. Still, we had a really great article on this in our recent issue of the magazine by Russell Shao. Again, recommend listeners take a look at that to get a thorough overview of all the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department has undertaken efforts in Taiwan to try and influence the elections. But if Tsai Ing-wen does win re-election, I mean, that's going to be a pretty stark, I think, affirmation of Taiwan's will to greater self-determination and not necessarily independence, but to pursue the DPP favored path of maintaining Taiwan's autonomy. And especially as, again, going back to the U.S. here for a bit, we have seen signs that the U.S. under the Trump administration is is willing to continue the strong relationship with Taiwan. 2019 marked the 40th year anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, a major year for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So I think that too. I think we should see how that navigates. We have had a few staff departures recently that I think might make Taiwan fall off the top of the Indo-Pacific agenda a little bit. I think in particular. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, Randy Shriver, is stepping down soon, and his departure, I think, is perhaps going to feed back in a way that makes U.S.-Taiwan policy less less of a priority for the administration than it was this year. But certainly, I think this is going to be one of the biggest stories to watch for this year. So yeah, I'm absolutely right there with you. Early 2020, we're going to be kicking off with a close look at Taiwan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your point about staff departures is really important, right? Because historically, with respect to U.S. Taiwan policy, personnel are really a particularly important marker for development of policy. And so, the departure of Randy Shriver and also John Bolton, who have been advocates for, better relationship with Taiwan, are going to affect how the Trump administration navigates this issue, particularly because I think we've had reporting in the past suggest that to the extent that we've seen better U.S.-Taiwan relations under Trump, Trump has sometimes acted as a lid on that as opposed to an accelerant, and that there are individuals within the administration that are actually promoting better ties with Taiwan, but Trump, in some senses, in his sort of wheel and deal fashion, really has been containing that effort. So that's certainly something to flag.
Mm-hmm.
What was your second issue to watch in 2020?
Sure, yeah, this was actually the one I was going to kick off on, but it seemed like a better segue to go with North Korea first. But I think one of the biggest stories in 2020 is really going to be India's political trajectory. 2019 has been, to put it lightly, I think a very significant year domestically for India, even in terms of regional security policy. Right, we had a remarkable February skirmish between India and Pakistan. But the second half of the year, particularly after the Bharatiya Janata Party, India's nationally dominant Hindu nationalist party, won a historic mandate in the general election, which the results were announced in late May 2019, gave Prime Minister Narendra Modi a second term. And what we've seen is that, I talked a little bit about this on the last episode, but basically the Indian government, as the national economy flags, GDP growth indicators are not as favorable as they used to be, has now turned towards enacting a divisive social agenda across the whole country, right? So we can begin with the August 5th decision by Home Minister Amit Shah and Narendra Modi to change the internal status of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, which has now been divided into two union territories of Ladakh and another one called Jammu and Kashmir. Still under lockdown, still with internet shutdowns, a lot of international scrutiny. But not only that, more recently, all over the country, you have student protests in India over the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, which passed both houses of parliament in India recently, and the National Register of Citizens. And the argument that India's liberals and opponents of the government have been making is that together the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens will effectively provide the Modi government with a very powerful institutional toolkit to alienate India's Muslim minority. And when I say minority, I'm talking about 200 million people in India. India is one of the largest Muslim countries in terms of absolute population size, just given the size of that minority. So the question now is, we're seeing all sorts of international criticism of India in a way that we really haven't seen in Modi's first term. Of course, when Modi was elected in 2014, there was a lot of concern about his legacy in Gujarat as chief minister and how he would bring that same sort of divisive conduct to the national prime ministership. For listeners that might not be aware, Modi was, although he was acquitted by the Indian Supreme Court, many people in India still hold him responsible for the communal riots that took place in Gujarat in 2002 that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Muslims and Hindus over religious issues. So the question going into 2020 is, does India continue down this path? When Modi was first elected in 2014, you sort of had, the international investor class view the BJP's election as potentially promising for economic reform. The BJP was seen as a center-right party that might take into consideration some of the bitter medicine of structural economic reform that the previous Congress-led alliance was unwilling to implement. There was some of that during the first term, did not go very well. There was experimentation with things like demonetization. The goods and services tax was something that investors had long seen as a positive development, was implemented poorly. And now we see sort of a negative correlation between India's economic performance and the rise of Hindu nationalism. So the big question is, does that continue? And then there are other, second order and third order effects for Indian diplomacy and foreign policy. One of the consequences, for example, of the National Register of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act is that it is probably going to feed back negatively in India's regional diplomacy, particularly with Bangladesh, which has been a very important relationship and one of the successes, I would say, of Modi's neighborhood policy, certainly from his first term. So there are questions now about the trajectory of the India-Bangladesh relationship in the neighborhood. But also one of the big things is the India-U.S. relationship. I just wrote about this recently, but I'm starting to see signs that, and I'm not the only one, I'm starting to see signs that the India-U.S. relationship is sort of closing the door on about 20 years of bipartisan support for a strong U.S.-India relationship. The support is still there in the United States, but at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, there is a more, there's a growing tendency now for many Democrats, progressive, center-left Democrats, to openly question India's trajectory and India's democratic bona fides. And if that continues into next year, into an election year in the United States, I think we might see the India-U.S. relationship also develop in an interesting way. So that's something I'm keeping an eye on, Prashant. I don't know if you have thoughts on where all this is going with India.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the fact that you illustrated that last point there about India's external relationships, including with the United States, raises a bigger question that we've seen. I guess maybe not to the same extent with some of the Asian leaders that we've seen in the past. So Prime Minister Abe in Japan, Prime Minister Najib in Malaysia, who's no longer in office. These leaders that promulgate a sort of a very advanced notion of foreign policy, very activist, and sometimes aligned with U.S. objectives. But domestically, sometimes they may take actions with respect to ideology, religion, in Najib's case, erosion of freedoms and human rights that the United States and other countries might find very difficult to actually stomach. So I suspect to a certain extent, this, the dynamic that we've seen in India and Prime Minister Modi in this new term reflects kind of that ongoing dynamic. I mean, how do external countries engage these countries where there's a little bit of a disjuncture in terms of their foreign policy and their domestic politics? And that not only affects, as you correctly pointed out, their internal dynamics, but also foreign policy. And different countries and different political parties within those countries will have different ways and different opinions about how to navigate those relationships. And I think you're right to point out, in the U.S. sense, we really have seen some folks speak out very fervently about some of the dynamics that we've seen in Modi's India and what that could, sort of lead to in a different administration other than the Trump administration, where human rights and ideals might be prioritized a little bit more, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and the only other thing is that Kashmir, I think, still remains very important going into 2020. It could be, again, the cauldron for some kind of major India-Pakistan crisis, depending on what transpires. For example, if we do have a repeat, unfortunately, of the kind of attack that we saw on Indian forces in mid-February this year that led to the eventual skirmish between India and Pakistan. Tensions are certainly very high in the Kashmir Valley. It is also very highly securitized still. With hundreds of thousands of Indian paramilitary and military personnel in the Kashmir Valley. So we'll have to keep a close eye on that going into next year as well. All right, so Prashant, with that, what is your third and final trend to look forward to as 2020 approaches?
So I was toying with how to frame this, but I think I would frame it more generally in terms of the evolving situation in the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea has been, a flashpoint, which we've talked about, plenty of times on the podcast. And I think, every year you could make a case for the South China Sea being a big issue to watch on any yearly forecast. But I do think 2020 will be a particularly interesting year with respect to how the South China Sea evolves. I think for a number of reasons. I mean, one is, the fact that you have Vietnam, which is, by far the most active claimant in the South China Sea of the four Southeast Asian claimants. holding the leadership of ASEAN in 2020, it's going to be very difficult for the Vietnamese government to actually avoid strong statements on the South China Sea, and actually speak out against what some of the Chinese actions are in the South China Sea. So that's, one of the reasons why I think it'd be notable to watch. I mean, the other thing that's interesting is you saw in the early stages of, President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, that you saw this notion of a China-Philippines sort of at least understanding on the South China Sea and pursuit of things like joint development. But those things have been moving quite slowly. And I suspect that in 2020, we could see a little bit of, a continuation of issues on that front. And the other thing is, we had some optimism over this notion of a code of conduct with respect to China and ASEAN and the South China Sea. But there's been, a trend of continued watering down of that code of conduct. And the essential question for 2020 is this the year where, if we've seen a stress on this notion that the Chinese are keen to promote, which is that, everything in the South China Sea has been calm after this, post 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling on the South China Sea, could 2020 be the year where we see the wheels really come off? And I think there are reasons to think that that could be the case. But even if we don't see the wheels come off entirely, I think the recent events that we saw in 2019, whether it be China-Vietnam tensions in the South China Sea, Malaysia, in fact, very recently issuing a sort of claim on the extended continental shelf, and some of these other developments, you look further ahead, Brunei is set to assume the ASEAN chairmanship for 2021. So they'll not be left with the option of being quiet on the South China Sea in 2020. You put all of that together, I think you have a pretty interesting case for the South China Sea being a bit of a flashpoint in 2020, more so than it was in 2019.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very compelling, and certainly you continue to see an appetite among regional powers to continue naval presence operations in the South China Sea, trilateral, quadrilateral, coordinated exercises, if not, patrols. But I think especially freedom of navigation operations, I think, will pretty much still remain in the domain of the United States in the South China Sea. But yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of factors here that will make us at least bring the South China Sea back up the news cycle, kind of where it used to be back in 2016, so to speak. It has been sort of down the radar for a bit, especially given the Trump administration's general silence on many of these issues. But of course, we'll have to look to see how some of these developments come together next year. I am quite curious to see how Malaysia's submission on the extended continental shelf to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf of the UN, how that ends up developing next year, and whether Vietnam decides that it's going to take any other legal action, especially given the very turbulent year that it just experienced with China and the South China Sea. There's also a few other developments that I think are worth watching, including rumblings about India potentially selling the Philippines the BrahMos supersonic missile. That would be a very, very significant capability upgrade for the Philippines military, which continues to be one of the region's major laggards, especially given the size of the country. Yeah, I think we'll certainly be talking about the South China Sea as a diplomat in 2020.
Absolutely. And I think, this is important to remind listeners too. I mean, this is beyond just dynamics in Southeast Asia, one of the world's most important waterways. And increasingly, it's not just been about just the claimants, but, a flashpoint for US-China rivalry as well. So, be very interesting to watch in 2020. What was your third and final thing to watch for 2020 in terms of forecasts?
Yeah, so I thought we have to mention Afghanistan. I mean, 2020 I think is, every year of the past 2 decades really. I think Afghanistan has been at the top of the geopolitical agenda in Asia. But certainly I think we're heading into 2020 with a very precarious state of affairs. I mean, we just got the first set of official election results from the Election Commission right before we started doing this podcast today. And it looks like, it confirms what most people expected, which is that Ashraf Ghani, the incumbent Afghan president, appears poised to win the election, to win the presidency, with his former chief executive in the National Unity Government, Abdullah, left behind. So we have a very familiar state of affairs to what happened in 2014. But of course, in 2014, we had a diplomatically capable and engaged United States. Secretary of State John Kerry managed to broker the National Unity Government agreement. That was certainly not ideal, but it kept things from absolutely disintegrating. And if you look at the Election Commission results in Afghanistan, you see a north-south divide, right? Very much predictable, with Abdullah taking most of the northern parts of the country, and Ghani certainly securing much of the Pashtun belt in the southern part of the country. So going into 2020, how will the election results be reconciled? Will they be accepted by Afghans? Will there be greater uncertainty? Will the United States have to intervene? These are, I think, many questions that I think pertain to the political state of affairs in Afghanistan. But then there's the other, talking about the political situation with the Afghan government. You begin to realize how little of Afghan territory is, solidly under the control of this government, especially with the Taliban maintaining certainly a very robust presence as the Afghan war continues into its 19th year in 2020, the United States' longest war. Of course, in September, we saw President Trump completely torpedo his special envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad's efforts to bring together some sort of a deal with the Taliban. And the state of U.S. Taliban talks remains very uncertain as 2020 comes to a close. So another big question is, do we see any kind of major deal with the Taliban? Trump, I think, although he might not say this much publicly, I think Trump would certainly welcome the opportunity in an election year to take dramatic action on Afghanistan, to finally become that American president that can really change the terms of the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And maybe this is one of those things where, given what I said earlier on the episode, which is that the administration is full of people that are far less likely to second guess the president, maybe Afghanistan is somewhere we do see dramatic change in how the United States maneuvers itself. So that's something I think we'll all be keeping a close eye on going into 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said, Afghanistan has been sort of this issue that's been on the list on an annual basis, but for right reasons, right? I mean, as we've discussed previously on the podcast, it's something that, it drags in countries, not only the United States, but also, Pakistan, India, Russia, China. This is something that, serves as an issue where various powers have an interest about the resolution. And I suspect that's going to be the case in 2020 as well. I mean, I would say the other thing about the aspect of the U.S. presence is, as you pointed out, this is often advertised as something as being, the longest U.S. war that actually the United States has been involved in, and it's also sort of spotlighted a key issue in U.S. foreign policy, which is, we're on this podcast that been talking about Asia. Afghanistan has been an example where the United States has been involved for a very long time. And it's actually viewed in some Asian capitals as distracting from where U.S. priorities should be, which is focused on East Asia. But if you think about a broader conception of Asia, Afghanistan would be, sort of a logical part of it. And so I definitely think that in 2020, people in Asia will be looking to see how the United States engages in this broader Middle East, Central Asian region, to see what bandwidth the United States has to engage in, other issues and areas, China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, certainly. I think, even the Trump administration's own strategic documents, including the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, have also acknowledged the need for that, right? I mean, if you're going to talk about great power competition with Russia and China, you can't be bogged down in quagmires in Afghanistan, and Iraq and Syria much longer. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely something that many other capitals will be keeping an eye on going into the next year. So there are so many other things that we could have talked about on this episode. I mean, just to name a few kind of honorable mentions that I'm going to be watching for next year. I am very curious to see the trajectory of China's Belt and Road Initiative more broadly next year, especially given some very interesting goings on in countries like the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Pakistan over the last year and a half, seeing how many of those threads carry on into 2020 and how much of an emphasis China continues to apply on this project. Other issues to look at include, I think, broader developments, including the prevalence of non-state groups in Southeast Asia and South Asia, regional terrorism, which we've talked about a fair bit on this podcast before, seeing some of those trends as well. So unfortunately, Prashant, we can't cover it all, but we will be back next year to certainly talk about many of these issues as they surface in the Asia Pacific news cycle. But I wanted to thank you for I wanted to thank you for joining me on the podcast this year. Certainly, I'm looking forward to being back in 2020 to talk about many of these issues and more with you.
Absolutely, good to be with you.
Great. So for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a new decade worth of podcasts that are sure to be just around the corner. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. We'd really appreciate that. And if you have any suggestions about the podcast, the content that you'd like to see on future episodes, any topics that you think are undercovered, please do shoot either me or Prashant a note on email or Twitter. We're happy to take that into consideration. We do take that into consideration when planning future episodes. We really do appreciate your feedback. It's always good to interact with our listeners, see what they're thinking about and what they're interested in. And finally, before we close out, a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.